This is the Take Your Turn 2022 tournament, the Go event, round 1 recap. There are 5 rounds and 10 players. Each set is 2 games with players switching colors between games. In our recap, we'll be looking at 1 game per set and highlighting a particular move or two, as well as discussing the general flow of the match. For more detailed game reviews, you can visit my YouTube channel, Arnfasta. We're going to go ahead and start with Spatius vs. Sequoia Game 1. And the game begins with Spatius playing black, opting for a heavy influence-based opening, much more towards the center. And the first few moves of the game are then heavily concentrated in the left here. So you can see there is this heavy pressure by Spatius to not only begin to build up a wall and a framework from which to push towards the E14 stone of theirs, but also to keep white contained. And then it's at this move here, at move 41 with J8 by Spatius, by black, that I think really sets off a large chunk of the game, I think for almost 100 moves afterwards. So this move here is Spatius, as I understand it, saying, I see, Sequoia, I see your 3 white stones here, and I see all this open space. I bet you want to try and get out into the center. I bet you want to try and establish a quick momentum into the center that I won't be able to contain, so I am going to try and lock you down. I'm going to try and immediately put a stop to it. But the result is that pressure that starts, that is initiated by Spatius, before too long gets turned around, and Sequoia does a really nice job of, if we're looking at move 82, now suddenly this center portion has 2 eyes, one here, and not a full eye yet, but at least 1 eye with the potential for a second, and a number of liberties and a number of space free to move up, versus a weak group of blacks here, a group with some concerns here and the cutting point here, and a group that isn't necessarily under immediate threat, but certainly isn't very strong. And as the game progresses, we're going to go ahead and obviously flip through these quickly. You can see that black is then under pressure to try and keep all these groups alive. Now, Spatius does a great job of keeping this right-hand side alive. So you can see. And then sort of overextends in the bottom right, trying to find a few more points there, trying to find a life or even a kill on the inside. And then again, Spatius does a nice job of, in the top right here, of being able to push themselves into the corner and outlive white. But at the same time, the result is that white ends up in the top center here in this portion of the board. Sequoia does a nice job of locking down and stopping many of black's attempts to create life and to create any sort of momentum. So we see now we're starting to get closer to the end game here. Another thing to note is you have this big mass of black stones, except that with those stones there are no eyes. There's no actual space for them to be able to establish any territory. And Sequoia, I think, does a great job of really trying to slowly prevent those possibilities from ever coming to fruition, such that by the end of the game, as we have a cleanup here by Sequoia, there's no space left. There's 3 liberties for black's group, 3 free spaces, of which there's no way for black to be able to make life. And so all those stones are dead. And so we're going to go ahead and flip to the end as Sequoia goes ahead and removes all the stones that are dead. And the result is a win for Sequoia by 105.5 points. The match went 2-0 in favor of Sequoia. I really like some of the ideas that Spatius had. I think Sequoia did a really nice job answering them. And because of that, Sequoia was able to turn some pressure into long-term advantages and leverage those advantages to turn what was a weak group into a very strong group and begin to have this multi-pronged attack that certainly paid off. And from there, next we're going to go ahead and look at Xeronox versus Atrades, Game 1. Xeronox is black, Atrades is white. And the key point for me in this game is very early on. So you can see they get set up, some initial moves down, and it's doesn't take long, but it's by about move, for me, by about move 24, though you could even say a little earlier. Atrades seems to have a desire, again, Atrades is playing white, seems to have a desire to establish a strong presence in the center. The concern here is that with an approach like this where you have everything concentrated in the center, that also means with this setup from Xeronox as black, you have 4 main directions in which you are under attack and you are under pressure. And because you have one currently, you have the framework for one large group. Any pressure that gets put on this one large group is a significant hit to your total points. Versus, for example, if we look at the corner here, if in the reverse, Atrades were to come after this top left, well, the top left may suffer, but the bottom left, the bottom right, these other 3 spaces are going to be unaffected and aren't immediately compromised. But any attack here jeopardizes the entire integrity of this one big territory that it seems like Atrades is going for. So as we look at that, the other big thing for me is, if we watch this play out a little bit, I think that Atrades, in trying to establish the center group, is in the way they put on pressure on black is kind of a gentle nudge. It's a gentle pressure to me, meaning that they don't ever dive in. They don't ever see if they can make something happen from behind behind enemy lines attack. Their attacks always seem to start or have some origination in the existing stones, and it means that there's a lot of pushing down, but not necessarily a lot of actual tear-throughs or breakthroughs. And so you can see the ways in which the existing lines, the existing setup here for Xeronox remains mostly untouched. It simply gets further strengthened, and in reality, it's definitely Xeronox who's allowed to go on the offensive and be very aggressive. I just want to take back a little bit. The other thing too is that move 55 here I think is worth looking at, because it's the beginning of a giant wedge in White's group, and we talk about how, since White is looking at a single big territory in the center, if you're able to puncture that territory at all, like with this move at L15 here by Black, you can do a lot of damage. And it takes a little bit before it really fully comes together, but we can see here with the move at N16, to me that's a form of that gentle pressure. Atrades is definitely trying to establish their territory and push back against Black, but the way they do so helps Black, mainly as I see it, as it begins to form out, helps Black mostly keep the territory in the lines that they had established earlier. Whereas I think one of the things that Xeronox was able to do very successfully here was find a lot of ways in which to poke in. And I think that's definitely one of the dangers in a center-based strategy like this, where all of your stones have to work together, so any threat to one is a threat to all. And it makes you a lot more vulnerable to those multi-pronged attacks, and it definitely requires you to be very, very on top of your game in order to protect everything. And also, I think more fundamentally, know exactly what you are and aren't willing to get rid of. What sacrifices you are and aren't willing to make. But this, so as you can see, we sort of, everything gets slowly resolved and the lines get solidified. And I think that there's a nice job here by Atrades in trying to make sure that the Black is never able to really take this left side entirely. But conversely, Xeronox is really able to just beeline their way into the center and prevent white from ever being able to really even get a good hold on the center, let alone the outside edges. And so the result is that Xeronox wins this game by resignation, and the match overall goes 2-over for Xeronox over Atrades. Next one we're going to look at is a game between Just Your Eventual Ruler and Exmo 5. So Newbie 101 is Just Your Eventual Ruler, or Ruler. And this is game 2, so Ruler is playing white, Exmo is playing black. And I think the game starts out fairly uneventfully. Both players do a nice job sketching out some outlines. It isn't until move 14 that Ruler begins to get aggressive. And move 14 I think is a big move because it plays, in my mind, it plays a key part in a literal board defining confrontation. So we can see white retreating, and then the left side develops for a little bit before we come back into the center. And at this point, it still isn't super clear to me exactly the significance of that move 14 play at M3 just yet. So again, looking at this M3 play by Ruler, by Just Your Eventual Ruler, or Newbie 101, it begins this beeline up here, and now what we have is around this sequence here, there's this back and forth. They're both trying to figure out, what do we do with the center? How do we resolve the center? And it's right around here, this move, 65, 66, that white is beginning to say, hey, I'm going to try to see if I can't take this, is sort of the sense I'm getting. I'm going to see how much of this territory I can really take and make my own. And so we have these fights here. Another thing that I think is nicely done here by Ruler is the reductions, just some forcing this down, forcing down in the sides here, and by doing this and by keeping Sente for a lot of the game, for keeping initiative, is Exmo has it looks like a hard time in being able to set the pace of the game, so they're constantly reacting to what Ruler is putting down. And so as this continues a little bit further, we're almost at the end of the game. Gets shored up, and we can see how these two moves, particularly this M3 play with back at move 14, eventually gets sacked, but it set the path for what would become this great wall of Ruler that Exmo wasn't able and really struggled to find a way to break in. And you can see from here to here, Exmo was absolutely looking for ways to kind of break in and to find some way to tear through and begin to reduce, but Ruler did a great job of not allowing Exmo to be able to get that initiative and to keep the pressure on Exmo such that wasn't possible. And the result is that Just Your Eventual Ruler, or Newbie 101, wins by 42.5 points, and the match was 2-0 overall for Ruler. Our next set is Gorgeous Goose versus Mr. Cat, game 1. Gorgeous Goose is white and Mr. Cat plays black. The game starts out fairly calmly. We have a dividing line that gets created on the right side before the focus shifts to the bottom left. So we're going to start, we're going to watch, there's this concentration here that builds up as they're fighting, setting up an initial set of structures to work off of. And then we kind of shift to, again, looking at that bottom left and trying to establish, go ahead and establish a foothold there. I think that Goose does a nice job of holding on to the bottom corner, and while Mr. Cat is able to get a little bit of that outside wall, to me it's looking like a heavy concentration of stones that aren't yet giving you anything. And so what I'm curious about will be, how does Mr. Cat transitions that? You know, when we're at this initial stage of the game, will Mr. Cat try and go underneath? Is Cat going to really try and make something happen in the center? It'll be interesting to see. Another thing to point out is that right now, the 3 corners are currently looking Goose favored. So that's 3 corners versus 1 for Cat in the bottom right. And I think that can put the options for Mr. Cat. The options are decreased for Mr. Cat, and I'm curious to see how they try to turn the situation into one in which they can keep up the pressure and prevent Goose from getting away with the larger corners from which to get points. Another big move here is this move at 56. So we talked about how earlier Goose had 3 of the corners, or a strong presence in 3 of the corners, and how Mr. Cat only had 1. Well, now Goose says, I want it all. And this is a bit of a teaser. As you can see, Mr. Cat is still focused on the top right, so we get that bit of foreshadowing. We get a cliffhanger, maybe, would be a better way to say it. We don't know what's going to happen. And it's a little while because this fight has to go ahead and resolve. The ladder has to resolve before we finally come back and move 80 here with this play at Q3. And now that Goose has the initiative again, Goose does, I think, a great job at just trying to slowly reduce to poke in. And now this territory that Mr. Cat is looking at has pressure coming from this way, had pressure coming from this way, though I think, again, Mr. Cat did a nice job of establishing a wall. But there's still some pressure here. There's certainly pressure here. And now Goose is really trying to put pressure from this direction as well, trying to find any way in which to whittle down and simultaneously begin to gather points on the side. And I think that Mr. Cat here they struggle to be able to lock Goose down, and Goose is able to scoot along the right edge here to eke out a few more points, and does a really nice job of that. Conversely, I think Goose is able to begin to establish a real wall, even as they're trying to defend against Goose. And then it's a little bit further. So right around here, there's this fight. And then we have this play here at J9. So Goose goes in at J9, and we've talked about it a couple times just in this recap, not even a full game review, just in this recap about the emphasis sometimes towards one large territory as opposed to sort of these split up territories here and here and here by Goose. Goose, because all of black is concentrated in this one large center, this move by Goose at J9, move 146, is just a great, that's a straight critical hit to the infrastructure that Mr. Cat is trying to build up. This territory this potential territory is really under threat now because Goose says, hey, I'm coming in, and you're going to need to answer me. And I think Goose does a nice job of really trying to recover by pulling back a little bit and saying, hey, okay, if you're going to come in that way, I'm going to at least stitch up and protect what I can here. And then it's sort of, we get this solidifying of territory, solidifying of the walls and the structures in place here. And again, we see Mr. Cat looking for ways in which to get any sort of points or find any sort of incursions. And I think in a full game review, we can look more at alternatives for that because it's a real challenge. But in this game, the way it played out, Goose did a very nice job of locking those down and preventing anything from being able to find enough of a foothold to be a real threat. And we get to the end of the game, and it is Gorgeous Goose wins that by resignation, and the match is also in favor of Gorgeous Goose 2-0. So the final set would be between Faded Sun and Cheezus, but that was a win for Faded Sun 2-0 because of absence. So This was a really fun set of games for me in this first round. I think one thing I noticed just across matches is that it felt like players sometimes were unsure or afraid to start new groups on the board, and if they weren't already connected to old groups. So players who could play wide or open early in the game were able to make it difficult for their opponents to catch up, because most of the attacks that would come later in the game were those gentle pushes, were those pushes that came from existing groups and weren't attacks so much as light pressure that allowed their opponent to just reinforce their position. So as players get more comfortable, I'm wondering if we'll see more volatile games that can punish players who start too big or who don't know how to shore up internally when they're attacked on the inside. I'm wondering if that will be the case, or if we'll continue to see a defining feature of some of these successful players be that they're able to play large and play loose in the beginning and then follow it up later. But this was round one of Take Your Turn. For a deeper dive into round one, you can check out my YouTube channel, Arnfasta. But for all things Wargroove, and certainly for chess and anything Take Your Turn, keep it right here on the Groove of War channel. Thanks, everyone.